Hello and welcome to chapter 12 of Leviticus in Teaching Through the Bible. Now we have been talking about Leviticus. We talked about first the sacrifices and the priests that give the sacrifices in chapters 1 through 10 and the instructions for that. But then those priests, they're supposed to be showing the differences between clean and unclean. They're supposed to be distinguishing that. They're supposed to be teaching the people that. How are they going to do that unless they also know what that is? How do they know what's clean, what's unclean throughout their lives? Well, now we have the instruction book for that, which is chapters 11 through 15. We just looked at the animals, what you can eat, what you can't eat, what is clean, what's not clean. We actually saw at the end of that as well, if you read through that chapter, you saw a big emphasis on when these animals die, the uncleanness that brings, a further emphasis on how bad it is to have death in the world. But now we're moving on to chapter 12. And this one, this has got some stuff we're going to really have to parse out here. It's only 8 verses, so I'd suggest if you haven't yet, pause the video, go ahead and read those 8 verses. But it's got some stuff in there. If you are doing this as a lesson for your Bible class, if you are a teenage boy, there may be a word or two in there you do not know. If that is the case, go ask your parents what that means. I'm going to be vague about it because it's some icky stuff. It's some but we don't skip that because it's still the Bible. It's still valuable. We still can learn from it. So we're not skipping this. But yeah, make sure you've read that chapter if you can. And we're going to start talking about childbirth. Yeah, chapter 12 is about childbirth. And it talks about a woman becoming unclean when she gives birth to a child. Now, that's from the flow of the blood, because that happens in childbirth. And now remember, we've already seen, even back in Genesis, that, especially chapter 9, that blood represents the life of a person. So if death is bad and someone's blood, the representation of their life, is leaving them, then this is not a good thing. This is something that makes them not perfect, right? They're not as they should be. And so they're now unclean. They need this process for becoming clean again. Well, if you look through it, it says one thing you may notice, difference between having a boy and a girl. If you have a boy, 7 days plus 33 more days. But if you have a girl, (14 plus 66). (40 days and 80 days). Takes twice as long to become clean again, to go through that process, if you give birth to a girl. You got 2 categories. You can either give birth to a boy or you can give birth to a girl. But you don't do the same thing. Or rather, you have to do the same thing, but you have to do twice as long if you have a girl. Why is that? Some people are just going to jump right on this and be like, sexism. But that is not the natural conclusion to jump to, unless that's just what you're looking for. You're just trying to find something to point out. You're just trying to find anything to complain about, like, there we go, easy case for sexism. But if you actually read and look at what are all the differences, then it becomes a little more clear. So that's one difference between having a boy and having a girl. There's another difference, though. Do you know what it is? If you don't know what the other difference is, go ahead and pause. Read those first few verses. Find that other difference. What is the other difference? So one difference is the time it takes to be pure. The other difference is boys get circumcised. Girls obviously do not. because girls don't have what it takes to be circumcised, if you know what I mean. They don't have that, so they're not circumcised. So boys are circumcised, girls are not. Well, so this is interesting. So you have, for a boy, the mother needs to be in this 40-day process before she can be clean. If she has a girl, she has to be an 80-day process. But why is that? Well, if 40-day process is what's necessary, then that right there, that's what she needs. Okay, good. Check mark, good to go. She can be clean. And the boy, though, what about the boy? Well, he had circumcision, which is a physical representation of cutting away of sin. It's a representation that he's cutting off the sin, just like the mother is doing what she's doing to be cleansed. And so, mother, check. Son, check. Both good to go. 40 days, we're done. What about with the daughter? Well, if it's 80 days, so it should only be 40 days, right? That's what it was over here. Well, if it is 40 days, what are the other 40 days for? That girl can't be circumcised. She doesn't have that physical representation. She doesn't have this ritual way of becoming clean on her own. She can't do that. The mother does it for her. Those other 40 days are for the mother to do that for her daughter, because the daughter cannot be cleansed on her own, which is pretty amazing as far as a way to point to Jesus, because Jesus does something that we can't do on our own. Now, that's not a perfect analogy, obviously. Jesus doesn't have to do that, representatively his 40 days, right? He doesn't have to cleanse himself, though he did in the New Testament, as we read through the Gospels, follow the Old Testament laws. He did do that. Even when he was being baptized, saying, I need to do all things to complete all righteousness, right? He still followed through with all the Old Testament stuff. And then, guess what? He died for us. He did what we couldn't to make us clean. What we couldn't do on our own. And so, the mother here is doing this for the daughter. So it's 40 days for her and 40 days for the daughter. So you could say, yeah, it's 80 days. She's doing it for 80 days. But 40 is for her, just like over here. Same thing. And then there's no circumcision, so 40 more days to replace that. So this is not some sexism thing that the mother has to do it twice as long. This is actually a good picture to us of the gospel of someone doing something on behalf of another and doing it for the one that can't do it on their own. Because she doesn't have circumcision to do that ritual. So that's what's going on there. But then we've got some other things that maybe are head scratching. So we've seen this first thing that does not say anything about women being inferior or some issue with biology in some way like that. So now that we've looked through that, there's some other things to notice, like how God is taking care of the poor here. He could have said, this is it, right? There are some things where he says, this is the standard, right? But he said, in this case, as we see in some other sacrifices, he says, but if they're poor, they can actually give a smaller sacrifice. They can give, instead of giving this sacrifice that's this much, they can give this sacrifice that's only this much. And it may be percentage-wise, even the same amount or more than what someone who's richer is giving, potentially. But the point is that there's a standard, but God he's understanding, hey, there's these poor people, and I'm looking out for the poor, and here is what I expect of the poor, which is not the same as he's expecting of the rich as far as what they're giving in the sacrifice. So that's just really cool. That's a really cool thing to notice, that there is that distinction there, that God is he cares about the poor, those who are less fortunate financially. And this is just another example that we see of that. It's certainly not the only example. It's plenty throughout the Bible, but here's a great example of that right there. So we see that in the second part of chapter 12. So first we've seen why there's this difference between having a boy and having a girl. And then we see the poor and how they're taken care of here. And then what about the fact that it says this offering, it's a sin offering. Now first there's a burnt offering, but then there's a sin offering. So is this sin? Is giving birth sin? Now, of course, technically, it's not the giving birth in either case. It's the bleeding. That's why the person is unclean. She's not unclean because she's giving birth. She's unclean because she's bleeding. Has this loss of blood. So is that sin? Now, most people, I think, are just going to say automatically, no, of course not. But why would you say that? Let's really think through what is the case here. At the end of the last video, I talked about very briefly at the end this unclean versus clean and sin with this unclean. How there's so much parallel there. They're so similar. Why is that? Are they the same thing or is there overlap? What's that all about? So we have clean and unclean, but then with the unclean, a lot of times there's this connection with sin. So there's a few different ways to kind of parse this out. One of them is that that's just kind of almost coincidental. Like unclean has to do with imperfection. Sin also has to do with imperfection, but imperfection doesn't mean sinful. They're not synonymous, and therefore, just because unclean has to do with imperfection, then it a lot of times is tied into the sin aspect, because sin also has to do with imperfection in other ways. And perhaps that's one option that we've got, that they just are both associated with imperfection. So but it could also be, perhaps it's not just imperfection. Perhaps it does have to do with sin. But even if that's the case, what way does it have to do with sin? Because even here, there's two different options. Is it that now birth would not have been this way? In a perfect world, birth and raising children, that all became so hard because of sin. We see that in Genesis chapter 3. So perhaps all this blood coming out, this imperfection being not part of the original design. Is it that this is something that comes as a result not of the woman sinning, but Adam's sin? The fact that there is sin in the world, this sin offering potentially being a sacrifice that's reminding of just the sin in the world. Perhaps that you got to then argue about why it is that she's got to give the sacrifice if it's not her own sin. That's a possibility you're gonna have to wrestle with as far as how do we see that? Do we see that anywhere else in the Bible? But a sacrifice that is for sin, but not necessarily her sin. I think in the New Testament of when the disciples say, hey, why was this guy born blind? Was it his parents' fault or was it his fault? Which one of them sinned? And Jesus said, no, it's not because one of them sinned. Now, sin is the reason the guy was blind, but it's because of Adam's sin that affects the whole world, and there would not be blindness in the world if there was no sin. That has messed up the world and caused things to not work as they're supposed to, and that includes people's eyes sometimes. So that guy's eyes, it's because of sin, but it's not because of his sin. It's not because of his parents' sin. It's not because of one person's sin, unless you want to point to Adam. So is that what it's talking about? Or is it that it's her sin? I know the immediate reaction is, Whoa, whoa, whoa. What are you talking about? Her sin. Now, that uh, that seems a bit much. And so how would we interpret this as her sin? Now, again, maybe it's one of the other options. Um, but if it is this, how are we going to look at that? How could that possibly make any sense? Well, we're going to look at the potential of that as an option in our next video. Thank you for watching that video. I hope that it helped you learn a little bit more about the Bible today. And if you'd like to continue to learn more about the Bible, then we have plenty of other videos on the channel. And if this has been helpful for you, then you can always let me know by subscribing to the channel. And hopefully I'll be able to continue to help you learn even more about God's Word. Thanks.